The ancient bells of Valeria Castle chimed 7 times, their bronze voices echoing across the misty courtyard where morning dew still clung to perfectly manicured rose bushes. Queen Isabella Rosemount stood at her chamber window, watching the sun paint golden streaks across the kingdom she had ruled for 23 years. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman of 62, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and eyes the color of winter storms. Those same eyes had witnessed the rise and fall of governments, the birth and death of traditions, and the careful dance of power that kept the monarchy alive in an increasingly modern world. Today felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the letter that had arrived the night before, sealed with the crimson wax of the High Council. Perhaps it was the way her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, had avoided her gaze during their morning briefing. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of the crown that seemed heavier with each passing year, like a beautiful prison that she could never escape. The knock on her door came precisely at 7:15, as it had every morning for the past decade. Captain Marcus Thornfield of the Royal Guard entered with his characteristic military bearing, his uniform pristine, and his dark hair showing the first traces of silver at the temples. At 45, he had served the crown for over 20 years, first under Isabella's late husband King Edmund, and now under her reign. His loyalty was unquestioned, his discretion absolute, and his presence in her private chambers a carefully guarded secret that only 3 people in the entire kingdom knew about. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, offering a slight bow that was more intimate than formal. "The morning briefing is ready for your review." Isabella turned from the window, her silk morning gown rustling softly. "Any urgent matters, Captain?" "The Prime Minister wishes to discuss the new education reforms at 10 o'clock. Lady Catherine has requested a private audience regarding Princess Sophia's recent behavioral concerns. And there's been another incident with the media camping outside the East Gates." The mention of her granddaughter brought a slight frown to Isabella's features. Princess Sophia, the 8-year-old daughter of Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Elena, had been displaying what the palace officials diplomatically called spirited independence lately. The child had always been headstrong, much like Isabella herself had been at that age, but recent reports from her tutors and nannies painted a picture of increasing defiance that worried the queen. "What kind of behavioral concerns?" Isabella asked, moving to her dressing table where Margaret had laid out her jewelry for the day. Marcus consulted his tablet, though Isabella suspected he already knew the details by heart. Yesterday, she refused to attend her etiquette lessons and instead spent 3 hours in the castle kitchens, helping the staff prepare meals for the homeless shelter. When her governess tried to retrieve her, Sophia apparently declared that learning to curtsy was less important than learning to help people who were hungry. Despite herself, Isabella felt a flash of pride at her granddaughter's words. The child had a heart as big as the kingdom itself, something that both delighted and terrified the queen. In a world where royal children were taught to smile on command and speak in carefully measured phrases, Sophia's authenticity was both refreshing and dangerous. And Lady Catherine's response? "She believes Princess Sophia needs stricter discipline. She suggested enrolling her in the boarding school in Switzerland that specializes in molding young aristocrats." The words hit Isabella like ice water. She had attended that same school as a child, where warmth was considered weakness, and emotions were systematically suppressed until students emerged as perfect, hollow shells of nobility. The thought of Sophia's bright spirit being crushed in those austere halls made Isabella's chest tighten with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel: protective fury. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had silenced Parliament more than once. "Sophia will remain here, where she belongs." Marcus nodded, though Isabella caught something in his expression that suggested there was more to the story. Before she could inquire further, another knock interrupted them. This time, it was Margaret, looking flustered in a way that was entirely unlike her usual composed demeanor. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but there's a situation developing in the blue drawing room. Princess Sophia well, she's barricaded herself inside and is refusing to come out for her morning lessons." Isabella exchanged a look with Marcus, who was already moving toward the door. "What exactly did she use to barricade herself in?" "Antique furniture, Your Majesty, including the Louis XIV armchair and what appears to be a marble bust of King Henry III. The image of her 8-year-old granddaughter moving heavy antiques to create a fortress was so absurd that Isabella almost smiled. Almost. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and assumed the mask of royal composure that she had worn for so many years it sometimes felt like her real face. "I'll handle this myself," she declared, brushing past both Marcus and Margaret. The walk through the castle's corridors gave Isabella time to think. The blue drawing room was on the second floor, overlooking the gardens where Sophia loved to play. It was also directly above the Grand Hall, where visiting dignitaries and members of Parliament often waited for audiences with the royal family. If Sophia was making enough noise to be heard downstairs, it would quickly become a public relations nightmare. As they approached the ornate double doors of the blue drawing room, Isabella could hear her granddaughter's voice through the thick wood, though she couldn't make out the words. Lady Catherine Whitmore stood outside the room like a general planning a siege, her gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her skin, and her mouth set in a thin line of disapproval. At 58, Catherine had served as Sophia's governess for 3 years, and her approach to child-rearing seemed to involve crushing any sign of individuality or spontaneity. "Your Majesty," Catherine said, offering a curtsy that managed to convey both respect and reproach. "I apologize for this embarrassing display. The child has become completely unmanageable. She threw her breakfast tray this morning when I informed her that her art supplies were being confiscated as punishment for yesterday's kitchen incident." Isabella's jaw tightened. "You confiscated her art supplies?" Her drawing and painting were becoming an obsession, Your Majesty. She was spending far too much time on frivolous activities instead of focusing on her studies. A princess must learn discipline and proper priorities. The Queen stared at Lady Catherine for a long moment, remembering her own childhood, when similar reasoning had been used to take away everything she loved, until she learned to love nothing at all. The memory brought with it a familiar ache, the ghost of the passionate, curious girl she had once been before duty and tradition had worn her down to acceptable royal specifications. "Captain Thornfield," Isabella said quietly, "please escort Lady Catherine to the library. I believe she has some research to complete regarding alternative educational approaches for gifted children." It was a diplomatic way of saying, "Get her out of my sight," and Marcus understood immediately. Catherine's face flushed with indignation, but she knew better than to argue with a direct order from the Queen. As she was led away, her footsteps sharp and angry on the marble floor, Isabella turned her attention to the barricaded door. "Sophia," she called out, her voice gentle but carrying clearly through the wood. "It's grandmother. May I come in?" The noise from inside stopped abruptly. There was a long pause, followed by the sound of furniture being moved. The door opened just a crack, revealing one bright blue eye and a tangle of dark curls. "Are you alone?" Sophia whispered. "Yes, darling. Just me." The door opened wider, and Isabella slipped inside, closing it behind her. The blue drawing room looked like a battlefield. Chairs were overturned, curtains were pulled down from their rods, and pillows were scattered across the floor. In the center of it all sat Princess Sophia, still in her pajamas, with tear tracks on her cheeks and defiance burning in her eyes. But what caught Isabella's attention immediately were the drawings scattered around the room. Dozens of them, created with colored pencils and watercolors, showing scenes from around the castle and kingdom. There were portraits of the kitchen staff, landscapes of the gardens, and incredibly detailed pictures of the homeless people Sophia had met during the charity visits that Lady Catherine disapproved of so strongly. "These are beautiful," Isabella said softly, kneeling down to examine a particularly striking drawing of an elderly man feeding pigeons in the village square. "Lady Catherine said they were a waste of time," Sophia said, her voice small and hurt. "She said princesses don't need to know how to draw poor people." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She looked at her granddaughter, this brilliant, compassionate child who saw beauty and humanity where others saw only duty and protocol, and felt something break open in her chest. It was as if she was seeing herself at 8 years old, before the palace had taught her to look away from suffering, before she had learned that caring too much was a luxury royalty couldn't afford. "Sophia," Isabella said, sitting down on the floor beside her granddaughter, not caring about the expensive silk of her morning gown. "Do you know why I became queen?" Sophia shook her head, wiping her nose on her pajama sleeve in a gesture that would have horrified Lady Catherine. "I became queen because I was born to it, just like you were born to be a princess. But being born to something doesn't mean you understand it. For a very long time, I thought being queen meant following all the rules, never making mistakes, and always putting duty before everything else. I thought I had to be perfect." "But you are perfect," Sophia said, looking confused. "Everyone says you're the best queen in the world." Isabella smiled sadly. Do you want to know a secret? I've made many mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was forgetting that being royal doesn't mean being less human. It means being more human. It means using the privilege we're born with to help people, to see them, to care about them the way you do. Sophia's eyes widened. Really? Really? And these drawings of yours? They show something that no amount of etiquette lessons can teach. They show that you have a heart that sees people for who they really are, not just what they represent. That's not a waste of time, Sophia. That's the most important quality a future queen can have. As Isabella spoke, she felt layers of carefully constructed royal reserve beginning to crumble. For years, she had worn her crown like armor, protecting herself from the emotional demands of leadership by creating distance between herself and everyone around her. But, looking at Sophia's artwork, seeing the world through her granddaughter's eyes, Isabella remembered what it felt like to feel deeply, to care without reservation. But, what about Lady Catherine? Sophia asked. She says I'm embarrassing the family. Isabella's expression hardened. Lady Catherine has forgotten something very important about our family. We rule because people trust us to care about them. If we stop caring, if we become so worried about appearing perfect that we forget to be real, then we don't deserve to rule at all. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Margaret's voice came through hesitantly. Your Majesty? The Prime Minister has arrived early. He's requesting an immediate audience regarding the education reform vote. Isabella sighed, feeling the weight of royal duty settling back on her shoulders. But this time, it felt different. Instead of crushing her, it felt like a responsibility she could bear with purpose. I have to go handle some boring political business, she told Sophia, standing and smoothing down her gown. But I want you to keep drawing. In fact, I have a special assignment for you. I want you to create a series of drawings showing how you think the kingdom could be better. What changes would you make if you were queen? Sophia's face lit up with excitement. Really? You want to see my ideas? More than that, Isabella said, her mind already forming a plan that would have shocked the traditional members of her court. I want you to present them to me formally, in the throne room, in front of the Privy Council. The idea was radical, unprecedented, and would undoubtedly cause an uproar among the conservative nobles who believed children should be seen and not heard until they reached adulthood. But, as Isabella looked at her granddaughter's eager face, she realized she didn't care about protocol anymore. What mattered was nurturing the kind of leader Sophia could become, someone who combined royal authority with genuine compassion. But, first, Isabella added with a smile, you need to get dressed and eat some breakfast. You can't change the world on an empty stomach. As she prepared to leave the room, Sophia grabbed her hand. Grandmother, are you really going to let me talk to the Privy Council? Isabella squeezed the small hand in hers, feeling the calluses from hours of drawing and painting. Sophia, I've spent my entire reign trying to be the queen people expected me to be. But, watching you, seeing how you care about people, has reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago. The best leaders aren't the ones who follow rules perfectly. They're the ones who know when to break rules for the right reasons. The words surprised Isabella even as she spoke them. She had just committed to something that would challenge every tradition the monarchy held dear. But, as she looked at Sophia's artwork scattered around the room, each piece showing a different aspect of the kingdom's people with love and attention, she knew she was making the right choice. Walking back through the castle corridors toward her meeting with the Prime Minister, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in years, excitement about the future. For too long, the monarchy had been a museum piece, beautiful and revered but ultimately static. Sophia represented the possibility of something new, a crown that could evolve without losing its meaning. Behind her, she could hear Sophia humming as she began to clean up the room, no doubt already planning the drawings that would soon shock the Privy Council into reconsidering everything they thought they knew about royal leadership. And, for the first time in decades, Queen Isabella found herself looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. The palace bells chimed 8 o'clock, marking the beginning of what would prove to be a day that changed everything. But Isabella didn't know that yet. All she knew was that her granddaughter had reminded her of something precious she had thought was lost forever. The courage to care more about doing what was right than about doing what was expected. The Prime Minister's early arrival sent ripples of tension through the palace corridors. Sir Richard Blackwood was a man who commanded respect through sheer presence alone. Tall, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of sharp intelligence that had kept him in power through 3 different monarchs. At 68, he had served as Prime Minister for 12 years and had never once requested an emergency audience without good reason. As Isabella made her way to the state drawing room where he waited, she could feel the familiar weight of political crisis settling around her like a familiar but unwelcome cloak. Marcus Thornfield fell into step beside her, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, our intelligence suggests this concerns the education reform bill, but there may be more to it." Sir Richard arrived with a security detail that's larger than usual, and he's brought Lord Chancellor Morrison and Foreign Secretary Davies. Isabella's steps slowed slightly. The presence of both the Lord Chancellor and Foreign Secretary suggested this was about more than domestic policy. The education reforms had been controversial enough. Isabella's push for increased funding for arts programs and humanitarian education had met with fierce resistance from traditionalist members of Parliament who believed such subjects were frivolous wastes of taxpayer money. But if foreign policy was now involved, the stakes had just become significantly higher. "Any word from our allies in Parliament?" she asked quietly. "Lady Margaret Fairfax sent word this morning. The Conservative bloc is organizing opposition to the arts funding provisions. They're calling it emotional manipulation disguised as education. Sir James Pemberton has been particularly vocal about what he terms the monarchy's dangerous drift towards sentimental governance." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be effective. Isabella's recent public appearances had indeed been more emotionally engaged than the careful neutral stance she had maintained for most of her reign. Her visit to the Children's Hospital last month, where she had spent hours reading to young patients and had been photographed wiping away tears, had been widely praised by the public, but had made some political observers uncomfortable. Royalty, they believed, should inspire through dignity and distance, not through displays of human feeling. But Sophia's influence on her grandmother had been gradually changing Isabella's approach to her role. The child's unconscious authenticity, her immediate emotional responses to both joy and injustice, had begun to crack the careful emotional control Isabella had maintained for decades. And now, it seemed, that crack was widening into something that threatened her political effectiveness. They reached the state drawing room, where Sir Richard waited with his delegation. The room itself was a masterpiece of royal intimidation, 30 feet long with soaring ceilings painted with allegorical scenes of justice and wisdom, furnished with antiques that had witnessed centuries of political maneuvering. Isabella took her place in the chair that had been positioned to catch the morning light, a subtle psychological advantage that made her appear to glow while leaving her visitors partially in shadow. "Prime Minister," she said, inclining her head in acknowledgement. "Lord Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, I understand there are matters requiring immediate attention." Sir Richard stood, his expression more serious than Isabella had seen it in years. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid we're facing a situation that threatens both the education reform bill and, potentially, the stability of the monarchy itself." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Isabella had weathered political storms before, but something in Richard's tone suggested this was different, more dangerous. "Please, speak plainly." Lord Chancellor Morrison, a thin man with the demeanor of someone perpetually disappointed by the world, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we've received intelligence that certain factions within Parliament are planning to use the education reform debate as a launching point for broader questions about the monarchy's relevance in modern Britain. Specifically, they're arguing that recent changes in your leadership style suggest an institution that has lost its way." Foreign Secretary Davies, a woman whose diplomatic career had been built on delivering bad news with unwavering composure, opened a leather portfolio. "We've also received concerning communications from several Commonwealth realms. The Australian Prime Minister, in particular, has expressed private concerns about what he calls the monarchy's increasing politicization. There are whispers about potential Republican movements gaining momentum if the Crown is perceived as abandoning traditional neutrality." Isabella felt the familiar chill of political calculation settling over her emotions. For 23 years, she had navigated these waters by maintaining careful balance, never allowing personal feelings to override strategic considerations. But Sophia's influence had been changing that approach, making her more willing to take stands based on moral conviction rather than political expediency. "What specific actions have triggered these concerns?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sir Richard consulted his notes. "Your visit to the refugee center in Manchester, where you publicly criticized the government's asylum policies. Your support for increased mental health funding after visiting veterans with PTSD, a position that contradicts the Treasury's current austerity measures. And, most recently, Your proposal to include humanitarian education and arts funding in the school reforms, which many see as an attempt to influence political priorities rather than remaining above the fray. Each item on the list represented a moment when Isabella had chosen compassion over caution, when Sophia's influence had encouraged her to speak from the heart rather than the head. Now those choices were being weaponized against her, transformed from humanitarian gestures into evidence of dangerous political overreach. There's more, Lord Chancellor Morrison added grimly. We've learned that certain members of your own family have been expressing concerns privately about your recent decisions. Lady Catherine Whitmore has been in communication with several prominent Conservative MPs, suggesting that the Queen's judgment may be being unduly influenced by what she terms inappropriate emotional attachments. The betrayal hit Isabella like ice water. Lady Catherine wasn't just undermining Sophia's education. She was actively working to destabilize the throne itself. The woman who had been trusted with raising the next generation of royalty was using her position to fuel political opposition to the crown. What is Lady Catherine's specific claim? Isabella asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the fury building in her chest. Sir Richard shifted uncomfortably. She's suggesting that your close relationship with Princess Sophia has led you to adopt the child's emotional perspective rather than maintaining the mature detachment necessary for effective leadership. She's described your recent policy positions as the wishful thinking of a child filtered through the power of a crown. The insult was carefully crafted to be devastating on multiple levels. It attacked Isabella's competence as a leader, her emotional stability, and her fitness to guide the monarchy through challenging times. But, most damaging of all, it turned Sophia's influence, which Isabella had come to see as a source of renewed purpose and authentic connection, into evidence of weakness and poor judgment. Foreign Secretary Davies leaned forward. Your Majesty, we need to address this situation before it escalates further. The Republican movements in Australia and Canada are already using these criticisms as evidence that the monarchy has become too unstable and politically compromised to serve as a unifying constitutional symbol. Isabella stared out the tall windows at the gardens where Sophia loved to play, remembering her granddaughter's drawings of homeless people and refugees, the careful attention the child paid to faces that most adults learned to overlook. Those drawings represented everything Isabella had rediscovered about the true purpose of leadership, not to maintain comfortable distance from suffering, but to acknowledge it, address it, and use privilege to create meaningful change. But now that rediscovered purpose was threatening everything she had spent her life building. The monarchy's survival depended on broad public support and political neutrality. If her reign was seen as divisive or politically compromised, it could trigger constitutional crises that might ultimately end the institution itself. What do you recommend? She asked finally. Sir Richard exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. We believe you need to distance yourself publicly from the more controversial positions you've taken recently. Withdraw your support for the humanitarian education provisions in the school reforms. Issue a statement reaffirming your commitment to constitutional neutrality. And, perhaps most importantly, he paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to suggest. Most importantly, you may need to limit Princess Sophia's access to state functions and policy discussions. Lady Catherine has convinced several MPs that the child's influence on your decision-making represents a breach of constitutional protocol. They're arguing that allowing an 8-year-old to influence policy decisions, even indirectly, demonstrates unfitness to rule. The suggestion hit Isabella like a physical blow. They weren't just asking her to abandon the political positions that had grown from Sophia's influence. They were asking her to abandon Sophia herself, to treat her granddaughter's compassion and authenticity as contamination that needed to be quarantined from the serious business of government. You're asking me to choose between my granddaughter and my crown, Isabella said quietly. We're asking you to choose between personal sentiment and institutional survival, Lord Chancellor Morrison replied without a hint of apology. The monarchy has endured for over 1,000 years by placing duty above emotion. Your recent decisions suggest a dangerous prioritization of feeling over responsibility. Isabella stood and walked to the window, needing distance from the suffocating presence of political calculation. Below, she could see the gardens where Sophia chased butterflies and drew pictures of flowers, where the child's laughter had begun to crack through decades of careful royal isolation. Those moments had made Isabella feel more alive, more connected to her purpose, than anything else in her reign. But now those same moments were being characterized as evidence of weakness, poor judgment, and constitutional unfitness. The establishment was demanding that she choose between the part of herself that Sophia had helped her rediscover and the throne that had defined her identity for over 2 decades. "How long do I have to make this decision?" she asked. "The education reform vote is scheduled for next week," Sir Richard replied. "If you're going to withdraw your support for the controversial provisions, it needs to happen before then. And the statement about constitutional neutrality should be issued within the next 48 hours to prevent further speculation about your fitness to rule." Isabella nodded slowly, her mind already working through the implications. If she capitulated to these demands, she could preserve her throne and maintain the constitutional stability that the Commonwealth depended on. But she would also be betraying everything Sophia had taught her about the true responsibilities of leadership, about the moral imperative to use power on behalf of those who had none. "I'll need time to consider these recommendations," she said finally. "Of course, Your Majesty. But please remember, delay itself sends a message. The longer you take to distance yourself from these controversial positions, the more ammunition you give to those who question your judgment." After the delegation left, Isabella remained at the window, staring at the gardens, but seeing nothing. The choice they had presented her with felt like choosing between 2 different versions of herself: the careful, controlled monarch who had maintained stability for over 20 years, and the more authentic, emotionally engaged leader she had become under Sophia's influence. Marcus Thornfield, who had remained silently present throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "Your Majesty, is there anything I can do?" Isabella turned to look at him. This man who had served her faithfully for decades and who had witnessed her transformation from distant ruler to someone capable of genuine emotional connection. In his eyes, she saw understanding, support, and something else, respect for the person she had become, not just the position she held. "Marcus, do you think I've become unfit to rule?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think you've become more fit to rule than you've ever been. But fitness and political survival aren't always the same thing." The honesty of his answer cut through Isabella's confusion like a blade. He was right. Her growing authenticity and emotional engagement had made her a better leader in moral terms. But those same qualities were threatening her ability to lead at all. What would happen to Sophia if I lost the throne? She would still be a princess, still have every material advantage, still grow up in privilege and comfort. But would she still have the chance to believe that privilege comes with the responsibility to care? Would she still think that being royal means being more human, not less? Marcus met her gaze steadily. That would depend on who raises her. The words hung between them, loaded with implication. If Isabella lost her throne, or if she was forced to distance herself from Sophia to preserve it, Lady Catherine and others like her would shape the child's understanding of royal responsibility. Sophia would learn to see her compassion as weakness, her authenticity as inappropriate, her desire to help people as a dangerous distraction from the serious business of maintaining power. Isabella walked back to her desk, where a photograph of Sophia sat beside the official portraits of past monarchs. The child was laughing in the picture, covered in paint from one of her art sessions, utterly unself-conscious and radiantly alive. Looking at that photograph, Isabella realized that the choice she faced wasn't really about politics at all. It was about what kind of world she wanted to leave behind, and what kind of woman she wanted Sophia to become. The afternoon stretched ahead of her, filled with decisions that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the monarchy itself. And somewhere in the castle, Sophia was probably working on her drawings for the Privy Council presentation, unaware that her grandmother was being forced to choose between the crown and the very values the child had helped her rediscover. Isabella picked up her phone to call her private secretary. There were preparations to make, strategies to consider, and a future to secure. But first, she had a promise to keep to an 8-year-old girl who still believed that queens existed to make the world better. The battle for the soul of the monarchy was about to begin. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the throne room as Isabella stood before the ornate golden chair that had seated 37 monarchs before her. The weight of their legacy pressed down upon her shoulders like an invisible crown, each predecessor whispering their own version of what it meant to rule. Today, she would discover whether their wisdom was eternal truth or whether it was time for a new understanding of royal responsibility to emerge. Princess Sophia sat cross-legged on the marble floor nearby, her art supplies spread around her like colorful soldiers preparing for battle. She had spent the morning creating what she called her kingdom improvement drawings, completely unaware that each stroke of her crayon was adding fuel to a political firestorm that threatened to consume everything Isabella held dear. The child hummed softly as she worked, occasionally holding up a drawing to examine it in the light, her young face serious with artistic concentration. "Grandmother," Sophia said suddenly, looking up from a particularly detailed drawing of children playing in what appeared to be a renovated orphanage. "Do you think the Privy Council will understand my pictures?" Isabella knelt beside her granddaughter, studying the artwork that had caused such controversy among the palace establishment. Each drawing was a window into Sophia's vision of a better kingdom. Homeless shelters transformed into communities, hospitals with gardens for healing, schools where children learned about helping others alongside traditional subjects. The technical skill was impressive for an 8-year-old, but what took Isabella's breath away was the hope radiating from each carefully rendered scene. "I think they'll understand that you see possibilities they've forgotten how to imagine," Isabella replied, picking up a drawing that showed children from different backgrounds playing together in a castle courtyard. "But, Sophia, I need to tell you something important. Some people think that caring about others makes us weak. They believe rulers should keep their distance from the people they serve." Sophia's brow furrowed in confusion. "But if you don't know what people need, how can you help them?" The question was so innocent, so fundamentally logical, that Isabella felt a wave of protective fury toward everyone who was trying to teach Sophia that such thinking was naive. The child's moral clarity was being treated as a threat to constitutional order, when it should have been celebrated as the foundation of truly ethical leadership. "That's exactly what I've been trying to understand," Isabella said gently. "And it's what I want you to help me explain to the Privy Council." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside. Isabella recognized the distinctive rhythm immediately, Lady Catherine's sharp heels clicking against marble with military precision. The woman had requested an urgent meeting, and Isabella suspected she knew what it would concern. The governess had undoubtedly heard about Sophia's planned presentation to the Privy Council, and her response would be swift and merciless. "Sophia," Isabella said quickly, "I want you to take your drawings to Captain Thornfield. He's waiting in the blue drawing room, and he's very interested in seeing your ideas about improving the castle security by making it more welcoming to visitors." It was a diplomatic way of getting Sophia out of range before Lady Catherine arrived with whatever poison she had prepared. The child gathered her artwork eagerly, excited to share her vision with someone who would appreciate it, unaware that she was being protected from forces that sought to crush her spirit before it could fully bloom. After Sophia left, Isabella arranged herself in one of the formal chairs near the throne, assuming the posture of royal authority that had become second nature over decades of practice. When Lady Catherine entered, her expression was a masterclass in controlled disapproval, her gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her already angular features into sharp lines of judgment. "Your Majesty," Catherine said, offering a curtsy that managed to convey both respect and reproach, "I must speak with you about Princess Sophia's presentation to the Privy Council. The entire palace is buzzing with speculation about what you could possibly hope to accomplish by subjecting distinguished statesmen to the artistic scribblings of a child." Isabella felt her jaw tighten at the dismissive language, but kept her voice level. Princess Sophia's artistic scribblings demonstrate a depth of understanding about governance that some distinguished statesmen would do well to emulate. "Your Majesty, with the greatest respect, you are allowing sentiment to cloud your judgment. A child's perspective on complex political issues is, by definition, uninformed and emotionally driven. By elevating Sophia's opinions to the level of state policy, you risk undermining the very foundations of rational governance." The words were delivered with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worldview, never questioned whether emotional engagement might actually enhance rather than compromise effective leadership. Lady Catherine represented everything Isabella had been trained to become: cool, rational, and utterly detached from the messy realities of human suffering. "Lady Catherine," Isabella said carefully, "you've served this family for many years. In that time, you've attempted to shape Sophia into what you believe a princess should be. But I've begun to wonder whether your definition of royal fitness might be incomplete." Catherine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your Majesty, I've devoted my life to ensuring that royal children understand their duties and obligations. Princess Sophia's current behavior, her emotional outbursts, her inappropriate concerns for people outside her station, her resistance to proper discipline suggests that she lacks the emotional control necessary for future leadership. Or perhaps it suggests that she possesses exactly the kind of emotional intelligence that leadership requires, Isabella countered. You speak of emotional control as if feeling deeply about the welfare of her future subjects were a character flaw rather than a qualification for the throne. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the throne room door. Marcus Thornfield entered, his expression grave in a way that immediately put Isabella on alert. Behind him followed Sir Richard Blackwood and two other men Isabella didn't immediately recognize, older gentlemen with the bearing of senior civil servants or academic administrators. Your Majesty, Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral, the Prime Minister has returned with colleagues from the Constitutional Review Committee. They've requested an immediate audience regarding Princess Sophia's planned presentation. Isabella's stomach dropped. The Constitutional Review Committee was rarely convened, and never for trivial matters. Their presence suggested that Sophia's innocent art project had somehow escalated into a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. Gentlemen, Isabella said, rising to receive them formally. What brings you here on such short notice? Sir Richard stepped forward, his expression more serious than Isabella had ever seen it. Your Majesty, we've received a formal complaint from 12 members of Parliament regarding what they term the inappropriate politicization of a minor royal. They're demanding an immediate investigation into whether Princess Sophia's planned presentation constitutes a breach of constitutional protocol. The words hit Isabella like ice water. They weren't just opposing Sophia's presentation. They were characterizing it as a form of child abuse, suggesting that Isabella was exploiting her granddaughter for political purposes. The accusation was so devastating, so perfectly crafted to destroy both Isabella's credibility and her relationship with Sophia, that she had to admire its tactical brilliance even as it made her feel physically sick. Furthermore, continued Professor Edmund Hartwell, whom Isabella now recognized as the chair of the Constitutional Review Committee, we've received testimony suggesting that Princess Sophia's influence on your recent policy decisions may constitute an unprecedented breach of the separation between personal and state authority. The concern is that allowing a child's perspective to influence governance decisions represents a dangerous precedent that could undermine the constitutional foundations of the monarchy. Lady Catherine stepped forward, her expression a perfect mask of reluctant duty. Your Majesty, I feel compelled to support these concerns. In my professional opinion as Princess Sophia's governess, the child has become emotionally overwrought by exposure to complex political issues that she lacks the maturity to understand. Her recent behavior suggests psychological distress that could be exacerbated by the pressure of addressing the Privy Council. The betrayal was complete and masterfully executed. Lady Catherine had transformed Isabella's decision to honor Sophia's compassion into evidence of child endangerment, casting herself as the protective adult trying to save an innocent child from exploitation by her own grandmother. It was political theater at its most ruthless, and Isabella found herself genuinely impressed by the sophistication of the attack even as it destroyed everything she had been trying to build. What specifically are you alleging? Isabella asked, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. Professor Hartwell consulted a thick folder of documents. The formal complaint alleges that you have inappropriately exposed Princess Sophia to adult political concepts, encouraged her to form opinions on matters beyond her comprehension, and are now planning to use her public presentation as a vehicle for advancing your own political agenda while hiding behind the supposed innocence of a child's perspective. Each word was a carefully placed dagger, designed to make Isabella's every interaction with Sophia appear calculating and manipulative. The beautiful morning they had spent discussing Sophia's drawings was being rewritten as evidence of political indoctrination. The child's natural compassion was being characterized as manufactured sentiment designed to advance Isabella's agenda. Moreover, added Dr. William Reynolds, the committee's child welfare specialist, we have concerns about the psychological impact on Princess Sophia herself. Children her age lack the cognitive development necessary to understand the implications of their political statements. By encouraging her to believe her opinions matter at a state level, you may be setting her up for future psychological damage when she inevitably discovers the limitations of her actual influence. Isabella stared at the assembled men, these guardians of constitutional order who had somehow convinced themselves that caring about people was a character flaw and that protecting a child's compassion was a form of abuse. They represented everything she had been trained to become, rational, detached, and utterly committed to maintaining systems that prioritize stability over justice, order over humanity. "And what do you recommend?" she asked quietly. Sir Richard exchanged glances with his colleagues before responding. "We recommend that Princess Sophia's presentation to the Privy Council be cancelled immediately. We further recommend that she be temporarily removed from the palace environment to allow for psychological evaluation and appropriate therapeutic intervention. Lady Catherine has generously offered to oversee her care at a specialized facility that deals with children who have been exposed to inappropriate adult pressures." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, each syllable designed to strip away everything Isabella valued most. They weren't just asking her to choose between Sophia and the throne. They were threatening to take Sophia away entirely, to redefine the child's compassion as mental illness that required professional treatment. Isabella looked at Lady Catherine, understanding now the full scope of the woman's ambition. She hadn't just been undermining Sophia's education. She had been systematically building a case for removing the child from Isabella's influence entirely. The governess had positioned herself as the rational adult protecting an innocent child from the dangerous emotional instability of a grandmother who had lost her way. "How long would this devaluation take?" Isabella asked. "Quite some time," Dr. Reynolds replied with what he probably thought was reassuring professionalism. "Children who have been exposed to adult political pressures often require extensive therapy to help them understand appropriate boundaries between childhood concerns and adult responsibilities. Princess Sophia would need to learn to separate her natural childish empathy from the complex realities of governance." The phrase childish empathy hit Isabella like a physical blow. They were proposing to cure Sophia of the very qualities that made her extraordinary: her ability to see suffering and want to heal it, her instinctive understanding that privilege came with responsibility, her refusal to accept that caring deeply was a sign of weakness rather than strength. Isabella walked to the throne room windows, looking out at the gardens where Sophia had chased butterflies that morning, completely unaware that powerful adults were gathering to destroy her spirit in the name of protecting her psychological health. The irony was perfect and devastating. The people claiming to save Sophia from inappropriate adult influence were the same ones trying to teach her that compassion was a character flaw. "I need time to consider these recommendations," Isabella said finally. "Of course, Your Majesty," Sir Richard replied. "But please understand that delay itself may be interpreted as continued evidence of impaired judgment. The longer Princess Sophia remains in this emotionally charged environment, the more difficult her eventual recovery may become." After they left, Isabella remained at the window, watching shadows lengthen across the gardens as the afternoon sun began to set. The choice they had presented her with was even starker than she had initially realized. She could save her throne by sacrificing Sophia, or she could protect Sophia by destroying the institution that had defined her identity for over 20 years. But, as she stood there, surrounded by the portraits of 37 previous monarchs who had ruled through compromise and calculation, Isabella began to wonder whether there might be a third option, one that would require more courage than any of her predecessors had ever needed to demonstrate. The battle for Sophia's soul was about to begin in earnest, and Isabella was finally ready to fight. The emergency session of the Privy Council convened at sunset, with emergency lighting casting harsh shadows across the ornate chamber that had witnessed centuries of momentous decisions. 24 of Britain's most powerful figures sat around the ancient oak table, their faces grave with the knowledge that they were about to participate in something unprecedented in the monarchy's long history. Isabella entered wearing the St. Edward's crown, a deliberate choice that emphasized both the weight of royal authority and the historic significance of what was about to unfold. But the most shocking sight in the room wasn't the queen in full regalia. It was 8-year-old Princess Sophia, sitting beside her grandmother in a specially placed child-sized chair, her artwork arranged on an easel like evidence in a trial. The child wore a simple blue dress and had her dark hair pulled back with a ribbon, looking impossibly small against the grandeur of the ancient chamber. In her lap, she held a single drawing, one she hadn't shown Isabella yet. Lord Chancellor Morrison rose first, his expression making clear his disapproval of the entire proceeding. "Your Majesty, the Privy Council has gathered in response to serious concerns about the constitutional implications of this presentation. We must state for the record that allowing a minor to address this body on matters of state policy represents an unprecedented breach of protocol." Isabella remained seated, her posture conveying the authority of 1,000 years of royal tradition, even as she prepared to overturn every convention those traditions represented. Lord Chancellor, this council has advised monarchs through wars, plagues, and constitutional crises. Today, we face a different kind of crisis, one that threatens not our institutions, but our souls. The dramatic language sent ripples of unease around the table. These were pragmatic men and women, comfortable with political maneuvering, but deeply uncomfortable with appeals to moral authority. Sir Richard Blackwood shifted in his seat, clearly wishing he could stop what he sensed was about to become a historic disaster. Princess Sophia, Isabella continued, placing a gentle hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, has been accused of inappropriate political influence. She stands accused of seeing suffering and wanting to heal it, of believing that privilege comes with responsibility, of imagining that the monarchy exists to serve rather than to rule. If these are crimes, then we must examine what we have become. Sophia looked up at her grandmother with complete trust, unaware that her very presence in this chamber was being treated as evidence of constitutional vandalism. In her innocence, she had no idea that powerful adults were debating whether her compassion represented a threat to the established order. Foreign Secretary Davies leaned forward. Your Majesty, with profound respect, the concerns raised are not about Princess Sophia's character, but about the appropriateness of involving a child in state affairs. Surely you can understand the precedent this sets. I understand the precedent, Isabella replied. I understand that we are establishing whether the monarchy serves the people or whether the people exist to preserve the monarchy's comfort. I understand that we are deciding whether compassion disqualifies one from leadership or whether the absence of compassion is what truly renders leadership illegitimate. The words hung in the chamber like an accusation, forcing each council member to confront their own assumptions about the nature of power and responsibility. Isabella could see them struggling with the moral challenge she had presented, their political instincts warring with deeper questions about the purpose of governance itself. Sophia, Isabella said gently, would you like to show the council your drawings? The child stood with careful dignity, approaching the easel where her artwork was displayed. Her small voice carried clearly in the ancient chamber as she began to speak, her words innocent of political calculation, but devastating in their moral clarity. I drew these because I wanted to understand what a queen is supposed to do, Sophia said, pointing to her first drawing, a detailed scene of children playing in a renovated orphanage. Grandmother told me that being royal means being responsible for people, so I tried to draw what that looked like. Lord Henderson, the trade secretary, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Princess Sophia, those are very colorful pictures. But running a kingdom is more complicated than helping children play. Sophia considered this seriously, her young face thoughtful. But why does it have to be complicated? If people are hungry, you feed them. If they're sad, you try to help them feel better. If children don't have homes, you build them better places to live. That seems simple to me. The naive logic was devastating precisely because it was unanswerable. Sophia had reduced governance to its essential moral core, stripping away the layers of political complexity that adults use to justify inaction in the face of clear suffering. Her perspective wasn't sophisticated, but it was pure in a way that made the council's objections sound like elaborate rationalizations for callousness. Professor Hartwell, who had spent his career studying constitutional law, found himself struggling to formulate a response to an 8-year-old who had just challenged the fundamental assumptions of his life's work. Princess Sophia, governance requires difficult choices. Sometimes helping one group means not being able to help another group. Sophia nodded seriously. I know that. But shouldn't we try to help as many people as we can? And shouldn't we start with the people who need help the most? The question struck the chamber like lightning, illuminating the moral landscape in ways that made everyone's comfortable positions suddenly seem questionable. Here was a child who instinctively understood principles of distributive justice that political philosophers had debated for centuries, and she had arrived at her conclusions not through academic study but through simple moral intuition. Sir Richard attempted to regain control of the proceedings. Your Majesty, while Princess Sophia's perspective is touching, we cannot base national policy on the emotional reactions of a child. Governance requires rational analysis, careful consideration of competing interests, and what? Isabella interrupted, her voice carrying the full authority of the crown. And the systematic suppression of moral instincts that might interfere with political convenience? And the careful cultivation of indifference to suffering when that suffering proves inconvenient to address. The accusation was devastating because it contained enough truth to be unanswerable. Isabella was exposing the ugly reality behind political pragmatism, that it often served as a cover for moral cowardice, that rational analysis frequently meant finding sophisticated reasons to avoid doing what everyone knew was right. Sophia, oblivious to the political undercurrents swirling around her, continued her presentation with the focused intensity of a child absorbed in explaining something important to adults she trusted to understand. She showed them her drawing of hospitals with healing gardens, her vision of schools where children learned about compassion alongside mathematics, her carefully rendered scenes of communities where homelessness had been replaced with dignity. Each image was a small masterpiece of hope, showing not just what was, but what could be if power were wielded with love instead of fear, if governance were guided by moral imagination instead of narrow self-interest. The technical skill was impressive for a child her age, but what took the viewer's breath away was the absolute conviction that suffering was an aberration to be healed rather than an inevitable reality to be managed. The most important one, Sophia said, carefully lifting the drawing she had kept in her lap, is this one. She held up a picture that made several council members gasp audibly. It showed the throne room where they now sat, but transformed. Instead of the formal arrangement of power and protocol, Sophia had drawn children and adults sitting together in a circle, sharing food and stories. The throne itself was surrounded by people of all ages and backgrounds, and the figure wearing the crown was clearly meant to be Isabella, but an Isabella who was laughing, with her arms around children who looked up at her with complete trust and affection. I drew this because I wanted to show what I think a throne room should really look like, Sophia explained. Not scary and formal, but like a place where people come to feel safe and loved. Because if you're the queen, shouldn't your most important job be making sure people aren't afraid? The drawing represented everything that terrified the political establishment, the complete dissolution of hierarchical barriers, the prioritization of emotional connection over institutional authority, the transformation of governance from control mechanism to nurturing relationship. It was a child's vision of radical love applied to statecraft, and it was simultaneously beautiful and utterly threatening to everyone whose power depended on maintaining careful distance from those they governed. Lord Chancellor Morrison found his voice first. Your Majesty, while Princess Sophia's artistic vision is imaginative, surely you cannot seriously suggest that we restructure the entire constitutional framework based on the fantasies of a child. Isabella stood, her presence commanding the attention of every person in the chamber. Lord Chancellor, I am not suggesting we restructure our constitutional framework based on Sophia's fantasies. I am suggesting we examine whether our current framework serves the people we are sworn to protect, or whether it primarily serves to protect us from the people we have forgotten how to love. The words crackled with the force of moral revelation, challenging not just specific policies, but the entire philosophical foundation of modern monarchy. Isabella was proposing nothing less than a complete reimagining of royal purpose, from symbolic figurehead to active agent of social transformation. Moreover, Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, I am announcing that Princess Sophia will not be subjected to the psychological evaluation that has been recommended. She will not be removed from the palace for therapeutic intervention. And she will not be taught to see her compassion as a mental health disorder requiring professional treatment. The declaration sent shockwaves around the table. Isabella was openly defying the Constitutional Review Committee's recommendations, choosing to protect Sophia's spirit even at the cost of her own political survival. Instead, Isabella said, lifting Sophia into her arms in a gesture that would have been unthinkable in any previous generation of royal protocol, Princess Sophia will continue her education here, where she can learn that caring about people is not a character flaw, but the highest qualification for leadership. She will continue creating art that imagines better worlds, because imagination is not a luxury, but a necessity for anyone who hopes to create meaningful change. The chamber erupted in urgent whispers as council members struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Isabella had essentially chosen to side with an 8-year-old child against the entire political establishment, making Sophia's perspective the foundation of a new approach to royal authority that prioritized moral leadership over political stability. Sir Richard stood, his face pale with the recognition that he was witnessing the potential destruction of everything he had worked to preserve. Your Majesty, I must formally advise you that this decision may trigger a constitutional crisis. Parliament will not tolerate governance based on the emotional impulses of a child. The Commonwealth realms will not accept. The Commonwealth realms will accept a monarchy that serves rather than rules. Isabella interrupted, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had finally found her true purpose. They will accept leadership that acknowledges suffering instead of ignoring it. And they will accept a crown that stands for love instead of fear, or they will replace it with something that does. The ultimatum was clear and devastating. Isabella was essentially challenging the entire Commonwealth to choose between a monarchy that served power and a monarchy that served people. She was betting everything on the possibility that Sophia's vision of radical compassion could transform not just Britain, but the entire modern concept of royal authority. As the council session dissolved into chaos, with urgent consultations and emergency protocols being activated, Sophia remained peacefully in her grandmother's arms, still holding her drawing of the transformed throne room. She didn't understand the political implications of what had just happened, but she understood that her grandmother had chosen to protect something precious, the belief that love was stronger than fear, that hope was more powerful than cynicism, and that even queens could learn important lessons from children who still remembered how to dream of better worlds. The revolution had begun, and its leader was 8 years old. 3 months after the most controversial Privy Council session in British history, the consequences of Isabella's choice continued to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. The immediate aftermath had been swift and brutal. 12 Conservative MPs had called for her abdication. The Australian Parliament had initiated preliminary discussions about Republican status, and Lady Catherine Whitmore had been quietly reassigned to a ceremonial position where her influence over royal education policy was permanently neutralized. But something unexpected had happened in the weeks that followed. Instead of the constitutional collapse that political experts had predicted, public support for the monarchy had surged to levels not seen since the early days of Isabella's reign. The image of an 8-year-old princess presenting her vision of a more compassionate kingdom had captured imaginations around the world, inspiring a global conversation about the true purpose of leadership in modern democracies. Isabella stood in the newly renovated blue drawing room, watching Sophia work on her latest project, a series of paintings depicting the homeless shelter that had been established in one of the palace's unused wings. The child had insisted on spending time with the shelter residents, learning their stories and capturing their dignity in watercolor portraits that now hung in the palace's public galleries. What had once been called inappropriate political involvement was now celebrated as a revolutionary approach to royal engagement. "Grandmother," Sophia said, looking up from a particularly striking portrait of an elderly veteran who had found refuge in the shelter. "Mr. Thompson told me he used to be in the army. He said protecting people was his job, just like being queen is your job." Isabella smiled, remembering her conversation with that same veteran the day before. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had struggled with homelessness after his discharge, until the palace shelter program had given him not just housing but purpose. He now coordinated services for other veterans in need. "He's right," Isabella replied. "But I think you've helped me understand something important about protection. It's not just about keeping people safe from danger. Sometimes it's about protecting their hope, their dignity, their belief that the world can be better than it is." The past 3 months had transformed Isabella's understanding of queenship more profoundly than the previous 23 years combined. Sophia's influence had guided her toward a model of royal authority based on radical availability rather than institutional distance. The Queen now held regular public forums where citizens could share their concerns directly, participated in community service projects alongside palace staff, and had instituted policies that treated the royal estate as a resource for public good rather than private privilege. Marcus Thornfield entered the room, carrying the latest briefing folders, but his demeanor had changed significantly since the crisis began. Where once he had served as a buffer between Isabella and emotional engagement, he now facilitated her deeper involvement with the people she served. His role had evolved from protector of royal isolation to enabler of royal connection. "Your Majesty," he said, "I have updates on several fronts. The Commonwealth Conference has formally endorsed what they're calling the Valeria model of constitutional monarchy. New Zealand and Canada have both requested assistance in implementing similar programs. And, perhaps most importantly, Oxford University wants to establish a research center for compassionate governance, with Princess Sophia as the honorary inspiration." Isabella felt a surge of pride mixed with protective concern. Sophia's influence was spreading far beyond Britain's borders, inspiring political leaders around the world to reconsider the relationship between power and empathy. But the child herself remained refreshingly unaware of her growing international significance, focused entirely on the immediate task of helping people she could see and touch. "What about the domestic situation?" Isabella asked. Marcus consulted his notes, though Isabella suspected he had memorized every detail. "The education reform bill passed with unprecedented support after your amendments were included. The arts and humanitarian education programs are being implemented in over 3,000 schools. Youth homelessness has decreased by 30% in the regions where palace-sponsored programs have been established. And, perhaps most significantly, charitable giving has increased by 60% nationally since Sophia's presentation to the Privy Council." The statistics told only part of the story. What couldn't be measured was the shift in public discourse about leadership, the growing expectation that those in power should demonstrate not just competence, but compassion, not just authority, but authenticity. Sophia's childish conviction that suffering was unacceptable had somehow become the foundation for a new political consensus that government existed to serve human flourishing rather than institutional preservation. "There is one concerning development," Marcus added carefully. "Lady Catherine has been in communication with certain international observers who question the sustainability of emotion-based governance. They argue that Princess Sophia's approach, while inspiring, cannot address complex international challenges that require difficult compromises." Isabella had been expecting this challenge. Sophia's moral clarity was indeed limited by her age and experience. The child could envision ending homelessness and hunger, but she couldn't yet comprehend the complex geopolitical realities that constrained international action. The question was whether Sophia's compassionate vision could serve as a guiding star for more sophisticated policymaking, or whether adult complexity would inevitably corrupt her pure intentions. "What do you think, Marcus?" Isabella asked. "Can Sophia's influence survive contact with the real complexity of governance?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching Sophia carefully blend colors for her painting, completely absorbed in capturing the precise shade of kindness in an old man's eyes. "I think the question isn't whether her influence can survive complexity. I think the question is whether our complexity can survive her influence. Whether we're brave enough to let a child's moral imagination reshape our understanding of what's possible." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Crown Prince Alexander and Princess Elena, Sophia's parents, who had spent the past 3 months navigating the delicate balance between supporting their daughter's extraordinary impact and protecting her from the pressures that came with international attention. Alexander, heir to the throne, had initially been skeptical of his daughter's involvement in state affairs, but had gradually become one of her strongest advocates as he witnessed the positive transformation of public engagement with the monarchy. "Mother," Alexander said, embracing Isabella warmly. "Elena and I wanted to discuss Sophia's future education. We've been approached by several institutions that want to create specialized programs for her, but we're concerned about preserving her authenticity." It was the central challenge facing the royal family: how to nurture Sophia's extraordinary gifts without destroying the innocence that made them powerful. The child's moral clarity depended partly on her freedom from cynicism, her ability to see the world as it could be rather than accepting it as it was. But she also needed to develop the sophisticated understanding necessary to translate her vision into effective policy. "What does Sophia want?" Isabella asked. Elena smiled. "She wants to keep painting, keep visiting people who need help, and keep asking why things can't be better. Beyond that, she doesn't much care about formal education. She learns more from conversations with shelter residents than she does from traditional tutoring." Isabella nodded, understanding the dilemma. Sophia's education was happening through direct engagement with human need, through the process of seeing suffering and imagining solutions. But that education needed to be supplemented with more traditional knowledge if she was going to be able to implement her vision effectively when she came of age. "Perhaps," Isabella suggested, "we could create something new, an educational approach that combines Sophia's direct service learning with more formal study, but always keeps human welfare as the central organizing principle." It was a radical idea, designing an educational curriculum around compassion rather than competition, around service rather than achievement, around moral imagination rather than mere intellectual development. But it seemed like the logical extension of everything Sophia had already taught them about the purpose of royal preparation. Their discussion was interrupted by Sophia herself, who had finished her painting and was eager to share it with her family. The portrait she had created was stunning. It captured not just the veteran's physical appearance, but somehow managed to convey his dignity, his pain, his resilience, and his hope all in a few careful brushstrokes. He told me he wants to teach other soldiers how to ask for help when they need it, Sophia explained. He said sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is admit they're hurt and let people take care of them. The wisdom embedded in those simple words struck all the adults in the room. Here was a child who had learned about courage not from textbooks or military history, but from listening to a homeless veteran explain his own journey from isolation to community. Her education was happening through empathy, through the patient work of understanding how other people experience the world. Sophia, Isabella said gently, do you ever think about what you want to do when you grow up? Sophia considered the question seriously, as she always did when adults asked her important things. I want to help people feel less scared. I think a lot of people are scared a lot of the time, and they don't know how to make it stop. Maybe if I learn enough about helping people, I can figure out how to make a place where nobody has to be scared anymore. The vision was impossibly ambitious and utterly pure, a world without fear, created through the patient application of love and attention to human need. It was the kind of goal that sophisticated adults would dismiss as naive fantasy, but Sophia spoke about it with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had already seen evidence that love could transform even the most hardened situations. Isabella looked around the room at her son, daughter-in-law, and closest advisor, all of whom had been transformed by Sophia's influence into more compassionate, more authentic versions of themselves. The child had somehow managed to create a small kingdom of kindness within the palace walls, proving that her vision wasn't just theoretical, but practical, not just inspiring, but achievable. Your Majesty, Marcus said softly, there's one more update I should mention. The polls released this morning show public approval of the monarchy at 87%, the highest level since coronation records began. More importantly, for the first time in modern history, young people express more positive feelings about the royal family than older generations do. The statistic was remarkable not just for its magnitude, but for what it represented. Sophia's influence had somehow made an ancient institution relevant to people who had grown up questioning the value of inherited authority. By demonstrating that royal privilege could be wielded in service of justice rather than self-interest, she had given the monarchy a new lease on life that no amount of traditional pageantry could have achieved. As evening fell over the palace, Isabella found herself standing once again at the window where she had begun this journey months earlier, watching Sophia play in the gardens with children from the palace shelter. The scene would have been unthinkable under the old protocols, royal and common children playing together as equals, their laughter echoing off walls that had once enforced rigid hierarchical separation. But more than the external changes, Isabella felt the internal transformation that Sophia's influence had wrought. The careful emotional control that had defined her reign for over 2 decades had given way to something more powerful, the willingness to feel deeply about the welfare of others, to let that feeling guide her decisions even when it complicated political calculations. The choice she had made to protect Sophia's compassion rather than sacrifice it to political expediency had proven to be not just morally correct, but strategically brilliant. By choosing love over fear, hope over cynicism, Isabella had discovered a form of royal authority more powerful than anything based on tradition or constitutional precedent. As Sophia waved to her from the garden, paint still on her fingers from the day's artistic endeavors, Isabella understood that the revolution was far from over. The child would continue growing, learning, challenging assumptions about what leadership could look like. There would be new crises, new tests of whether compassionate governance could survive contact with an often cruel world. But, for now, in the golden light of evening, Isabella allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in decades, complete confidence that the future of the monarchy was in the right hands. Not because Sophia was perfect, but because she remained committed to the radical possibility that power existed to serve love rather than the other way around. The 8-year-old revolutionary was just getting started, and the world would never be the same. Outside, the children's laughter continued to echo through the palace gardens, carrying with it the promise of kingdoms built on kindness, crowns worn in service rather than dominance, and the eternal hope that tomorrow could always be more beautiful than today. In the end, that was Sophia's greatest gift to her grandmother and her kingdom, the unshakable belief that love, properly applied, could indeed transform everything it touched. The crown's secret had been revealed, and it was simpler and more powerful than anyone had imagined. True royal authority came not from the right to rule, but from the courage to serve.